Hello everybody and welcome back to the Hogs of War Miniatures game guide. Today it's part 3 of this series as we take a look at the ground action phase. Once again, as the name implies, it's going to be all about the troops and vehicles on the ground and what can be achieved by these Hog units. In the last episode we discussed the use of initiative points within the aerial action phase, and the same concept applies for the ground units. If we take a look at our pigs, the initiative of each unit is displayed in the top left corner of the card, once again represented by the timer symbol. The initiative number basically determines which pig or unit will take their turn first. The lower the number, the sooner the pig will go first. So for instance, out of all of our hog units, the orderly will go first because they have an initiative of 1, followed by the engineer on 2, the grunt on 3, the sniper on 4, bombardier on 5, and finally the tank unit on 6. And that is the order all players must follow each round during the ground action phase. So what can each unit do during this phase of play? Well, it comes down to the sausage symbol that shows how many action points each unit has, which determines how many things you can do during battle. Every hog unit has 2 action points, while the tank unit has 3. At a basic level, pigs will be able to use 1 action point to move and 1 action point to shoot. However, there is much more a player can do with all of their troops. Alongside being able to use 1 action point to shoot their weapon or move, pigs are also able to capture objectives such as promotion points or swill pumps and place deployables such as pillboxes, artillery pieces, AA guns and minefields. All hog units except for grunts will also be able to have additional abilities that can be used when deployed on the battlefield. For instance, orderlies are able to use 1 action point to either self-heal or can choose to heal an adjacent friendly hog. Engineers can use 1 action point to either reduce the building cost of a deployable by -1 swill, or can remove any burn damage from a friendly adjacent tank. Snipers can use 1 action point to either turn all rolled hits into a crit, or swap melee dice for 2 gun dice. And finally, bombardiers are able to use 1 action point to either increase or decrease their range by 1, or swap all gun dice for 1 explosive dice. It's also worth noting that if the player chooses to use an action point to move, they can only move in whatever direction they choose by 1 hex. Of course, the player could decide to use their other action point to move again, but once all action points are used, that unit cannot be used again until the next ground unit phase. Tank units, on the other hand, hold 3 action points, and the reason for having 1 extra action point is because the process of turning the tank counts as 1 action. Tanks do not have the freedom of maneuvering in any direction, as they need to be facing the direction they wish to travel before actually moving. This is also down to the design of the tank, as the main cannon and guns are front facing, so the player must be facing in the necessary direction in order to fire their weapon. Speaking of weaponry, the orderly's primary method of attack is via the rifle burst, which has a maximum range of 2. The engineer has the shotgun, which also has a max range of 2, meanwhile the sniper has the sniper rifle with a max range of 4, and the bombardier has the bazooka, whose range can be anywhere between 2 and 5, seeing as they can increase or decrease their range by 1 through using 1 action point as previously mentioned. Meanwhile, the machine guns on the tank have a max range of 3, while the heavy cannon has a complete range, as the max range here is 6. Additional weapon upgrade cards can also provide a mixed range of fire, however we'll be going into more detail about those once we reach the recruitment phase in the next video. Alright, so we now understand units' initiative, action points, and the default range each unit weapon holds, so how does damage work? Well, as we've established already, there are 3 types of damage dice. Red dice is for melee, blue dice is for guns, and green dice is for explosives. As we've seen from the default weapons used by our infantry, they all incorporate each type of dice depending on the range. The symbols on the dice indicate the type of damage that has been rolled, so if a player rolls an X, it means they have missed. If the player rolls this symbol, it means they have produced a glancing hit, which is equal to half a regular hit. So if the player rolls 2 glancing hits, that would be equal to 1 standard hit. If the player rolls this symbol, it means they have produced 1 hit point of damage. It's worth noting that all infantry take 2 hits to kill, or 1 critical hit. So if pigs have 2 health points, what happens if they only take 1 standard hit of damage? Well, if that happens, the player must apply a wound token on the damaged pig. And finally, if the player rolls this symbol, it means they have produced a critical hit, which, as I said, if that is rolled when you are fighting against infantry, you immediately kill them and they are removed from the battlefield. Green explosive dice are the most dangerous type of dice because they do not contain any glancing hits, meaning if the player rolls a green dice, they are more likely to produce a hit or a crit compared to the melee or gun dice. Meanwhile, damage to tanks works in the same way as damage to aircraft, except here there is more of a focus on the removal of action points in order to destroy a tank, seeing as it doesn't have a console like the biplane. So essentially the tank's health is equivalent to the amount of action points it has, in this case 3. Tanks can only be damaged by critical hits, and each time the tank suffers a critical hit, the opponent is allowed to roll a vehicle damage dice, as we showed previously in the aerial action phase. So once again, any burn results must be applied to the tank immediately by placing a burn token on the tank, and taking burn damage will also allow the opponent to roll an additional VDD if the tank takes another critical hit. Burn damage does not remove any action points from the tank, instead it simply increases the chances of the opponent rolling critical damage from a VDD, as there is no limit to how many burn tokens can be applied to a tank or vehicle. If the result of the VDD roll is a standard hit or critical damage, then a -1 action point token is applied to the tank, and once the tank receives 3 of these tokens, removing all of its action points, the tank is destroyed and removed from the battlefield. Now there are 4 types of deployables in the miniatures game. We have AA guns. We briefly touched on this deployable in the base building phase, but as you can see it has a maximum range of 5 and primarily uses explosive dice to target enemy aircraft. Alongside being able to target aircraft that sits within their range, if a base building is being targeted by an enemy plane or airship that happens to be adjacent to the AA gun, the player can automatically roll 4 gun dice in defense of said building. These guns cost 4 swill to deploy. Next up we have minefields. This deployable is the cheapest out of all 4, costing only 2 swill. Once deployed, should an enemy ground unit enter the hex occupied by the minefield, the player will be able to roll 4 explosive dice. Once the roll has been completed, the minefield should then be removed from the hex. Then we have pillboxes. These deployables have the lowest maximum range of 3, and they also cost 3 swill. This deployable is perhaps the weakest given its use of only melee and gun dice, so there is a higher chance that the player may produce limited damage when using the pillbox. And finally we have artillery. Being the most expensive deployable at the cost of 5 swill, the artillery makes up for its cost in range, giving the player the maximum available. The artillery also incorporates the use of melee and explosive dice, so compared to the pillbox, there is a much higher chance of critical damage being dealt. It's also worth noting that in order to use a pillbox AA gun or artillery, the player must have a hog unit that is adjacent to that deployable. The partial exception here though is that if you have an AA gun built in your base that is adjacent to a building that is being targeted by a bombing run, the player doesn't need to have a pig near it in order to use it. Remember, all deployables require 2 action points in order to fully build up on the battlefield. Players are able to only use 1 action point to partially construct the deployable should they not wish to use both of their action points. However, this does mean that a construction token must be placed on the deployable. Once another action point is used and the deployable is fully constructed, the token can then be removed. And last but not least, let's talk about capturing objectives and the board's terrain in relation to the ground action phase. Now, capturing objectives are key to victory, and in this game mode of King of the Swill, the objectives are key to sustaining a larger swill income. Capturing an objective takes 1 action point and can only be performed by hog units, so tanks and aircraft cannot do that. When an objective is captured, a flag token of the team capturing said objective is placed onto it, and the effect of the objective, in this case the production of 2 swill from the swill pump, is immediately added to the player's total and can be used within the current round of play during the recruitment phase. Now, the terrain on the board can pose big offensive and defensive advantages to either player. Water cannot be traversed by any ground unit, and it does not provide any cover bonuses to aerial units. Roads, on the other hand, will increase the movement of any ground unit by +1, meaning that if a unit were to move while standing on a road hex, they will be able to move 2 hexes forward by using just 1 action point. Elsewhere, forests actually remove 1 gun dice from the player's hand before the roll is made if they happen to be targeting a ground unit within it. Forests are impassable to ground unit vehicles unless they have an upgrade that allows it. Players also cannot attack enemy units when there is a forest hex between the two units. Mountains can only be traversed by unit hogs, so once again they are impassable to ground units, and this time if a player targets a ground unit positioned in the mountains, they must remove one explosive dice from their hand before rolling. And that, everybody, is a basic rundown of the ground action phase. You know, the main thing that scares me most about the miniatures game is the amount of additional content that will be added and covered in future when the full game is released. The amount of new vehicles, buildings, hog units and deployables that are going to be added is just insane. If you want to check out those details, then feel free to look at the Kickstarter page. You'll find the link to that in the description, and of course over there you can make late pledges to get your own copy of the game, and don't forget to check out their Facebook page to get the latest news on the game's production. In the meantime though, that's going to wrap it up for me and this video. I hope you can join me for the next episode where we move on to the fourth stage of play, the recruitment phase. So yeah, stay tuned and peace out everybody. I'll catch you all later for the next one.
Destination going. I'm going. There's destination going. Yeah.